All right, welcome to the 12-Minute Leadership Series. My name is Pittampalli. We got a good one for you today, folks. Today's topic is how to be persuasive in meetings. And I'm really excited about it. This is 12 minutes. It's going to be followed by a question and answer segment. So start submitting your questions at any time, and then at the end of the 12 minutes, we will launch into an optional question and answer. So it's important that we talk about what this topic means because there's a lot of information on the web and in print, and you may have read it, on how to be persuasive. And a lot of it is geared towards salespeople. And a lot of that information is very good, but it works short term, right? The focus is on how to make the sale or how to convince somebody of an idea in the moment, right now. That's not what I'm talking about today. What I want to talk about is a long-term approach to being persuasive. I'm talking about building the kind of reputation, the kind of credibility, the kind of trustworthiness as a leader that makes you a leader of influence, the kind of leader that when you're in a meeting and you talk, people listen. And not just listen regularly, but listen with a preparedness to change their mind. That kind of power of persuasiveness is what we're talking about. Now, some of the short-term tactics that work pretty effectively work well, but they actually reduce this kind of long-term persuasive ability. And what I want to do is I want to focus on the latter, not the former. Okay, so today I want to give you 5 tips to build this long-term persuasiveness, to make you a leader of influence. And as we go through these, I think you'll get a sense of what the tone of these tips are. So let's just launch right into it. Let's start with the first tip for how to be persuasive in meetings. The first tip is appeal to logic more than emotion. Now, for some people that learn about persuasiveness through books and on the web, this may seem radically strange because most people say the exact opposite. They say, focus on emotion. Emotion is what moves people. Emotion is what motivates people to get them to act and to adopt your idea. And although emotion works, right, that doesn't necessarily mean you should use it. Okay? I mean, think about who overly relies on emotions. Politicians, salespeople that have bad products, for example. These are the kinds of people that traffic in emotion for one simple reason. Emotion is really powerful, right? Emotion is often a extremely potent tool in order to persuade people. But the problem is you can use emotion to persuade anybody of anything. And people have, right? And what you want to do is you want to be a leader of influence. You want to use the right type of persuasion that actually validates your own idea. So the great thing about logic is it forces you to evaluate your own idea, right? You have to look at your own idea and ask yourself, why is this a good idea? What are the reasons? What is the logic behind it? What is the evidence? What is the data that allows me to know that this is a good idea? It's harder to understand that in order to persuade other people, but the benefits are extraordinary because now people will relate to you when you use logic primarily when persuading people. People will relate to you as somebody whose idea is already vetted. Because when somebody convinces you with emotion, you can't really tell whether it's a good idea or not necessarily. It's really when people can explain to you things in a logical fashion using evidence and facts to support that allows them to know that this is a truly good idea. Now, hear me out here. That doesn't mean you should never use emotion. That's not what I'm saying. Or never appeal to emotions. I appeal to emotions all the time. I use stories. What we're talking about is not overly relying on emotions. Focus on logic as the foundation of your argument, and then you can use emotion where appropriate, but you have to be responsible. You want to be known as the person who focuses on data and logic to persuade and not overly relies on emotion. Okay, step number 2, or the second tip for how to be persuasive. Focus on calibration, not always on confidence. So what do I mean by that? So the classic advice on how to be persuasive is to be confident, right? Leaders should always be confident because that's how you're persuasive. Once again, just because it works doesn't mean you should do it, okay? Because the reality is confidence is not what people think it is. Confidence should really mean the degree of certainty you have in a particular idea or belief, right? You shouldn't always be certain of every idea you have or every belief that you have. If you're always certain about something, something is wrong because the world is a very uncertain place, folks, and people, smart people, will see through that. So, for example, there are times, what you should be, calibration means you are appropriately confident based on the available evidence and your degree of certainty in that idea. So let me give you an example. Let's say you have an idea on some type of new initiative, for example, for your company or your team. And you do your research and you find out that so many other companies, 10 or 12 other companies in your industry have done this. They've all been successful. And so you come to the conclusion based on this that, this is a pretty good idea. Like, this should work for us. Well, because you've done that research and because you found this evidence, you should be confident, right? You should be highly confident in that idea, and you should show that confidence at meetings, and that's one of the tools you should use to persuade people. But hold on, I'm sorry. That's part of doing a live show, folks. Sometimes the phone rings. So back to what I was saying about confidence, which is that, let's say, for example, I have an idea, I've done my research, and I find out that this is a good idea. Well, what I would do is I would be confident, right? Appropriately confident, because I have evidence that suggests that this is a good idea. But imagine this is a new initiative now. This is a different scenario. This is a new initiative, and there is no available evidence out there, right? So no other companies have tried this before. You're proposing something that is completely new. Well, then you should be less confident, right? Because there's less evidence to support your idea. Now, that doesn't mean you shouldn't persuade people, right? You may want to go to people and say, hey, I think this is a good idea. I can't say I'm 100% confident in it because there's not a lot of evidence, but I think we should try this, right? That is a perfectly appropriate way to persuade people. And if you do it that way, then you're distinguishing between when you're confident and when you're not, because if you're confident all the time, people will just never take you seriously. But if you moderate your confidence, well then, and you're appropriately calibrated, then when you're confident, when you're extremely confident in somebody, you have the reputation of somebody who's not always confident, and therefore people are going to take notice, right? When you're really confident, people are going to be likely to adopt your idea. Okay, tip number 3, let them save face. So a lot of times when you're persuading people, people do not like to be persuaded in public. Okay, that's just, people see it as a sign of weakness in our culture, which I think is a tragedy, but that is often the case. And so if you're in a meeting with somebody and you're trying to aggressively persuade them, because by the way, it makes you look good often, because it makes you raise your status and lower their status, people are not going to want to really give into that. And that's where a lot of resistance comes from. But if you're known as the person that lets the other person save face, you're going to be a leader of influence, right? So imagine, for example, you're trying to convince somebody in a meeting and you notice that there's some resistance, but you notice that they're starting slowly coming around to your idea. Well, maybe you stop the meeting for a second and you say, you know what? It sounds like you have a little bit of doubt. Why don't we talk offline, Bob, in a one-on-one conversation where I can try to convince you further? And then you have another one-on-one conversation with them where in a private setting, this person is able to change their mind in a not-so-public setting. Well, that will give them the opportunity to save face, and they're going to be much more likely to change their mind. And again, now you're building the reputation of somebody who doesn't celebrate their own persuasiveness, but celebrates the other person's ability to change their mind, which again, over the long term, is a much better way to be persuasive. Okay, number 4. Number 4 tip for how to be persuasive in meetings. Use indirect methods. So a lot of times when we're being persuasive or when we want to convince somebody of something, we want the credit, right? Not only do we want them to adopt our idea, but we want them to know and everybody else to know that we were the ones who persuaded them, right? Because it makes us look good. Well, that is not a recipe for building this long-term persuasiveness that we're talking about. And a lot of times you can have much more success if you're willing to let somebody else or some other thing do the persuasion. So for example, a lot of people write to me telling me that they've tried to persuade their boss or one of their colleagues to revamp the way they do meetings, and they get a lot of resistance. So what they've done is they've gotten my book, they've bought my book, and they've given it to their boss, and that ended up being much more effective. And so, sorry, this person keeps wanting to get through to me. So the point of the matter is, in order to basically be more persuasive, what this person did was they handed the the book to this other person, and the other person was persuaded by way of the book. Now, what happens is the boss ends up thinking it's their idea, right? It's like they persuaded themselves. And that's often what you sacrifice when you use indirect methods of persuasion. But that's part of the territory. If you want to be a leader of influence, and if you want to be known for that, then you have to use every tactic available to you, whether or not you get the credit. Finally, number 5, be persuadable. Nobody is going to be persuaded by you if you are constantly unpersuadable, right? If you are a stubborn leader who never changes their own mind, then people are not going to want to be persuaded by you. People are not going to treat you as somebody who's a leader of influence, who's persuasive. So you need to find opportunities to change your own mind, to be persuaded. Now, this doesn't mean you should be persuaded just for the sake of being persuaded, right? That's not the way you should do it. But there's so many opportunities in an organization where people have good ideas, where people have valid arguments, where you should and where you can change your mind. So you should, and you should do it publicly, because when people know that you're flexible, they will be flexible themselves, okay? So these are the 5 tips. These are 5 tips that are a long-term approach to being persuasive inside of meetings, to be a leader of influence over time. They may not work in the short term, right? They may even make it harder in the short term to persuade the other person, but that doesn't matter because what you're going after is the long-term trust, credibility of being a leader of influence. So thanks for showing up to this 12-minute webinar. Right now, I'm going to go into the box and see if there are any questions. If you have to leave, good luck being persuasive. If not, I'm going to jump in here and see if we have any questions. So submit your questions now. Let's see. Okay, so Joseph asks whether we should never focus on emotion. I think Joseph is surprised that I'm saying that we should never focus on appealing to emotions. That's not, maybe you missed the beginning of the webinar. I'm not saying never focus on appealing to emotions, okay? First of all, even if you tried not to appeal to emotions, you would invariably appeal to emotions. I mean, logic and emotions are very hard to separate. What I'm saying is that the standard sales advice, the standard advice on being persuasive, is to move people through appeal to emotions primarily, okay? And I'm saying that is dangerous. What we should focus on mostly is appealing to people's logic, to use reasons, facts, and evidence to get them to come to our side. It's harder to do it that way, but it's more powerful because you will build the reputation of somebody who traffics in data, facts, and evidence, which, by the way, is where organizations are going. There's lots of organizations that run meetings in a way where if you don't have data to support your ideas, you're thrown out of the room. Nobody takes you seriously. And that is kind of the direction the world is moving in, because as we understand more about the world, as there's more data, it becomes possible to persuade people through these means. Now, again, I'm not saying don't use emotions too, because emotions are very powerful, stories are very powerful, but just don't have that be the foundation. Don't let that, don't use that to overcompensate for an idea where you don't have facts, logic, evidence to back yourself up. Okay. Lori asks, any tips for women? This is a really great question because I think that often these tips, this method of persuasion actually lends itself really well to the leadership style of women. I talk to a lot of women, and what they find is that this overconfident, kind of super aggressive way of persuading people is not their style, and they don't like pretending. And what I'm saying is I'm giving you permission to stop pretending, because what is happening, I think, is the world is changing. The leadership style that we've often associated with male dominance, like for example overconfidence, which worked really, really well in the past, is working less because people realize that there is not there. Confidence and accuracy are not as associated as people think. You can be totally confident and be totally wrong. And as the world starts moving in that direction, a lot of women who have a differing leadership style, the kind that I'm talking about right now, which is appropriately confident, actually have an advantage. So I would say to the person who just asked the question, if you have one of those leadership styles, go with that and really continue to persuade people in that way. Okay, Mick asks to repeat number 3. Number 3 is let them save face. So often when you're being persuasive, there's part of you that is turning it into a battle where you want to win and therefore the other person loses. I'm saying resist that instinct, resist that temptation, because although it may feel good, it makes you feel good, it makes you even look smart to other people, because we have this debate culture in our society where the person who wins the debate is the one who often is perceived to be higher status or higher intelligence. Even though there are those benefits, there's a real cost, which is that person is never going to want to be persuaded by you again. Okay? What you want to do is you want to try to persuade people in a way that makes them feel good, makes them feel respected, and makes them feel like they didn't lose. Okay? And so do what you can in order to save face. I mean, a lot of times it's just like a simple comment you have in a meeting. If somebody decides to change their mind, instead of celebrating yourself, either non-verbally or verbally, which we often do, because you want everybody to, you're pointing at yourself saying, did you see that, guys? Did everyone see that? You see how I just persuaded that guy? Don't do that. Do the opposite. Celebrate the other person. Kind of applaud the other person for having the courage to change their mind. Okay, Andrew has a question, which is the difference between calibration and confidence. Confidence seems to be a part of calibration. So yeah, they're very related. Basically, calibration means an appropriate level of confidence based on the available evidence, right? So you should always be calibrated. That's the goal. You should strive to always be calibrated. You shouldn't always be confident, okay? Like if you have, for example, an idea that you're trying to persuade somebody of, but you don't have a high degree of certainty in it because you just don't have a lot of evidence for the case, well then you shouldn't be overconfident. You shouldn't be too confident. You should be appropriately confident because you don't have a lot of evidence, okay? If, on the other hand, you do have a lot of evidence, then go ahead and be confident, right? Because you're signaling to the other person that, hey, I know what I'm talking about here. There's a lot of evidence to suggest what I'm saying is true, and therefore, remember that other time where I was being humble and I wasn't very confident? Now I'm being really confident, so therefore, I should have more impact. You should listen to me right now because I'm marking my word here that there's a more probability that this thing is going to work, right? So you're being strategic, right? Because again, you don't want to be the boy who cried wolf, because some people who are always confident, the confidence ends up not giving you any new information. When somebody is always confident, you end up just not taking them seriously after a while because you realize that, especially if they've been wrong in the past, well, how do I know your confidence is an indicator of a high probability of success in this situation when it wasn't in the past? Okay. Melissa asked the question, are there any other examples of letting others save face that don't include taking the conversation offline? Yeah, I mean, this is an important, I'm glad we're talking about this because this is so important. I mean, it doesn't necessarily have to be something incredibly overt. I mean, a lot of times when you're persuading somebody inside of a meeting, okay, when you're trying to convince them of something, and they do get convinced, they do change their mind, they are rightfully going to feel embarrassed because in our culture, there is this shame that comes with changing your mind. It feels like weakness, which is really silly, by the way. And that's something we need to completely change about our culture at large, but organization culture as well, because it's really damaging. But it is the reality in most organizations. So what you need to do is you need to honor and acknowledge that embarrassment. Don't add more fuel to the fire. So a lot of times when we persuade the other person, we kind of puff up in our chair and we get overly confident. We kind of celebrate ourselves. Even if we don't do it verbally, we do it non-verbally. What you want to do is you want to do the opposite. You want to be humble and you want to say something like, listen, Joe, thank you for changing your mind. I really appreciate it. I know that's not easy to do in a setting like this, but I think that we're both on the same page. We're both just trying to come up with the best idea. And that's the kind of tone. I don't know what words you want to use or what nonverbal gestures. That's depending on the situation, but that's the tone you want to take. You're really honoring that person for having the courage to be persuaded instead of celebrating your own personal victory. Okay. All right, folks. Well, that's all the time we have for questions today. But thank you so much for attending this webinar. Use those 5 tips, and over the long term, it's going to pay dividends. So thanks again for attending, and I'll see you next week.